Okay, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So if you have two congruent triangles, then there are, of course, 6 things. Okay, that's what we talked about the very first time we talked about triangle congruence, 3 sides and 3 angles. But if you're trying to prove something, you only need to show 3 things. Okay, so once you find 3 things of one triangle being congruent to 3 things of another triangle, you have 2 congruent triangles. Okay, so once you've proven those 2 triangles are congruent by finding 3 things, everything else is now also congruent. Because once your triangles are congruent, all of their parts are congruent. Okay, which is why this is corresponding parts of congruent triangles. So once you have the congruent triangles parts, all of their parts that correspond are also congruent. Okay? So it says here that everything that you assume to be true looking at the pictures, because your brain naturally looks for congruences and similarities and patterns, okay, you can now actually say is true. But first, you have to prove that the triangles are congruent. Okay, before you can say all of that stuff that you think is already true to be true. Okay, so you first have to prove the triangles are congruent, and then you use the 5 letters Cpctc to prove what you're asked to prove.
Sorry to interrupt y'all's class.
That's okay. I'm just recording this for the world.
That sounds like fun.
It is fun.
I don't miss that.
How long are you gonna be here?
I leave tonight actually, so I'm walking around tonight and work.
Stick around for an hour. I'll be back.
Okay, I'll be back.
Okay. Anywho, that was Jay. He goes to Washington. Okay, so here are the 2 proofs that you have in your notes. Okay, and these came directly from your quiz, so they should look kind of familiar to you, I am hoping. So, given angle E is congruent to angle R, and angle O is the midpoint of ER. Okay, just like we have it marked here. Prove that angle H is congruent to angle S. Okay, so notice the proof is different than we usually do. Usually it's prove triangle blah blah is congruent to triangle blah blah blah. Okay, so now we're trying to prove parts are congruent. So the first question is, what triangles do these things belong to? Like angle H, what triangle does it belong to? Right, EHO. So triangle H, or rather angle H belongs to triangle EHO, and triangle S belongs to RSO. Okay, so in order for these 2 angles to be congruent, these 2 triangles must first be congruent. Okay, so first thing we have to do is prove that the triangles are congruent, and then the next step is to use the corresponding parts of congruent triangles or congruent letters.
So we write the proof for the whole triangle?
Yes, so you have to write the proof for the whole triangle first, and then this is one additional step. Okay, so the givens are, of course, number 1, that angle E is congruent to angle R, given, and number 2 would be that O is the midpoint of segment ER, also given. Okay, so our 4 questions still apply. Because O is the midpoint, what is congruent? Segment EO is congruent to segment OR. Okay, and that is by the definition of your midpoint. Because we have a midpoint, you have congruent segments. Sorry, these are angles. Okay, and then from our picture, what else is true? Right, angle the left side of angle O and the right side of angle O. So from our picture, we know that angle HOE is congruent to angle ROS. Okay, and these are
Reflex.
the vertical angles. Okay, so the left side of this angle is congruent to the right side of this angle because these are vertical angles. So it's the vertical angle theorem that says these two angles are congruent. Okay, so we have our three things. So we can say with confidence that triangle
Maybe a little bit.
EHO is congruent to triangle RSO. And looking at the picture, this is by the angle side angle theorem. Okay, and here's the kicker. So now that we have congruent triangles, we know everything else is congruent. We know that HO is congruent to OS. We know that SR is congruent to HE. But we want to say that, of course, angle H is congruent to angle S. Okay, because these triangles are now congruent, all of their parts are congruent. Cpctc. Okay, and we're done. So you go through all the same steps that you normally do to prove that the triangles are congruent, and once they're congruent, all of their additional parts are congruent.
What's Cpctc again?
Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. It's like a diagram.
It's at the top of your little note page underneath the big 5 bolded letters. Okay? So once you have congruent triangles, all of their corresponding parts are also congruent. Okay, so that's how you use, or that's how you show that all of this stuff is also congruent because of the corresponding parts.
I'm really liking this.
Postulate. Okay, let's go on to this next one and see what it asks us to prove. So it wants us to show that U is the midpoint of AJ. Okay, so here's the question. In order to show U is a midpoint, what must be true? That's right. In order for U to be a midpoint, segment AU has to be the same length as UJ. Okay, that's what it means to be a midpoint. So we can work backwards. If we have congruent segments that are collinear, then we have a midpoint. So if we could show that these two segments are congruent, then we could have ourselves a midpoint. So what triangles do each of these segments belong to? Because in order to have congruent segments, we first must have congruent triangles. So it looks like AU belongs to triangle AUN, and UJ belongs to triangle JUN. Okay. So if we could show that triangle AUN and JUN were congruent, then these two segments would also be congruent, and then this would be the midpoint because you have congruent segments that are collinear. Okay, so that's the steps. It's actually going to take 9 lines. So save yourself some space. Okay, 9 lines. So step number 1, of course, is that UN is perpendicular to AJ. And just to save space, we'll make UN the angle bisector of angle. Okay, so just to save space, I'm going to combine both givens into one line so that you don't run out of paper. Okay, so because two lines are perpendicular, what is true?
Right angles.
Right angles. So angle AUN and angle JUN are right angles. Okay, that comes from the definition of perpendicular. Perpendicular lines give you right angles. Okay, so what do right angles give you? Congruent. So because they're both right angles, we can say that angle AUN is congruent to angle JUN. Okay, because of the, sorry, this is step number 3, the right angle theorem, which says all right angles are congruent. Okay, so perpendicular lines give you right angles, and right angles are congruent because of the right angle theorem. Okay, so we have one set of congruent angles. Now, because this is a bisector, what else do we know to be congruent? Angle ANU is congruent to angle JNU, like it's marked up there. Okay, and this is because of the definition of an angle bisector. Okay, because this is a bisector, you have two sets of congruent angles. So this angle is congruent to that angle. Okay, also an angle. Okay, so what else do we need from our picture? We need side UN. That's the third congruent thing. So UN is congruent to UN. This is the side that we want. This is the reflexive property. Okay, anytime two triangles share a side, they're congruent because of the reflexive property. Okay, so now I have enough information to say that these triangles are in fact congruent. So I have triangle AUN is congruent to triangle JUN. And looking at the picture, that is because of the angle side angle postulate. Okay, so now that I know that these two triangles are congruent, all of this other stuff, okay, these angles J and angle A are also congruent now. JN and AN are congruent, and also UA and UJ are also congruent. So the next step after we have congruent triangles is to list some of the congruent parts. In this case, we want UA to be congruent to UJ. And this is because of Cpctc. Okay, these are corresponding parts of triangles that we have proven to be congruent. And once you prove the triangles are congruent, all of their other parts are also congruent. So now because we have these two segments, our last step is to say that U must be a midpoint. Sorry, not must be, but U is a midpoint. It doesn't have to say must be. U is a midpoint of AJ. And that is, of course, using the definition of a midpoint. Okay, so just like if you're given a midpoint, you know congruent segments. If you know congruent segments, then that must be a midpoint as long as those points are of course collinear. Okay, just because these two things are congruent doesn't make N the midpoint. But over here, they're collinear, so they are congruent. Okay? Fantastic.